The air in the co-op office was thick with the smell of seed corn dust, stale coffee, and the subtle, sharp tang of anhydrous ammonia that clung to every farmer's clothes. It was early March 1974. Outside, a cold wind scoured the flat Iowa landscape, but inside, the talk was hot. Land prices were climbing faster than a squirrel up a hickory tree, and corn was pushing $3 a bushel. You could feel the optimism, thick and heavy as summer humidity. It was a dangerous feeling. I was leaning against the counter, waiting for old man Hemlock to finish writing up my ticket for seed and fertilizer. I wasn't buying much, just enough for the 320 acres my father had left me, paid for every square inch. That was the Stone family way. My father's words were etched into my mind like serial numbers on an engine block. If you can't hold the cash for it in your hand, Jedediah, you can't afford it. The door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air and Richard Miller. Rich was my age, but we were cut from different bolts of cloth. He strode in like he owned the place, grinning, his brand new John Deere cap perched on his head, the green and yellow so bright it hurt the eyes. He'd just taken over his father's operation, but he hadn't just taken it over. He'd leveraged it to the hilt. "Morning, gentlemen," Rich boomed, his voice echoing in the small office. He clapped a few guys on the back. "Looks like another good year to be turning dirt." He sauntered over to the counter, right next to me, and slapped a thick file folder down. It was full of papers from the Production Credit Association. Bank papers, loan papers. "Hemlock," he said, ignoring me completely, "I need you to double my usual order, picking up another quarter section north of town, and I'll need it delivered. The new 8630 is sitting at the dealership waiting for me. Figure I'll drive it home this afternoon." A low whistle went through the room. An 8630, John Deere's brand new articulated four-wheel drive, 275 horsepower at the flywheel, duals all the way around, a sound-guard cab with a radio and air conditioning. It was a spaceship compared to the tractors most of us were running. It cost more than most men's entire farms were worth just a decade prior. Hemlock peered over his glasses. "That's a lot of tractor, Rich." "It takes a lot of tractor to farm a lot of land," Rich shot back, finally turning his gaze to me. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn denim jacket and the grease under my fingernails that never quite washed out. He glanced out the window at my truck, a '65 Ford F100 with a mismatched fender. Then his eyes drifted to the corner of the lot where my tractor was parked. My International 1066. A good, solid machine with a strong back and an honest 125 horses. I'd rebuilt the engine myself 2 winters ago. It didn't owe me a dime. Rich smirked. "Still running that old red relic, Jed? Heard you had to split it again last fall. You ever figure you spend more time wrenching on that thing than you do in the field?" The other men shuffled their feet. This was Rich's way. He had to be the biggest rooster in the yard, and he did it by making everyone else feel small. I just nodded slowly. "She runs fine, Rich. Gets the work done." "Gets the work done?" He laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound. "Jed, the world is changing. You can't get by with a 100-horse tractor and a 6-bottom plow anymore. It's about volume, fence row to fence row. You're trying to bail the ocean with a thimble while the rest of us are launching battleships." He gestured with his thumb toward the window. "That 8630, that's the future. I'll have my ground worked in a week. How long is it going to take you with that little 1066? Memorial Day?" The sting of his words was meant to embarrass me, and it did. I could feel the eyes of the other farmers on me. They were all wrestling with the same demons. Borrow and expand, or stay small and risk getting swallowed up. Rich was the poster boy for the new way of thinking. I was a ghost of the old. I picked up my work gloves from the counter. "My ground will get worked, Rich. And when the note on that battleship of yours comes due every month, my 1066 will be sleeping sound in the shed, paid for." His smile tightened. I'd hit a nerve. Debt is a tool, Jed. A tool for growth, something you wouldn't understand. You're too scared to take a risk. Your old man was the same way. Died with cash in the bank and a farm half the size it could have been. Mentioning my father crossed a line. My knuckles went white around my gloves. I could smell the sourness of his cheap cologne mixed with the scent of new money. I took a breath, the cold air steadying me. A fight in the co-op wouldn't solve anything. My father died a free man, Rich. There's more to life than the number of acres on a deed. I took my ticket from Hemlock, gave him a nod, and walked out the door, the sound of Rich's laughter following me into the wind. As I climbed into my old Ford, the vinyl of the seat cracked and cold. I watched the dealer's flatbed truck rumble past, the monstrous green John Deere chained to its deck. It looked like a machine from another planet. For the first time, I felt a sliver of doubt. Was my father's way, my way, nothing more than a stubborn refusal to see the future? Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Take a moment and think back. Maybe it was your father or your grandfather. What was the one piece of advice they gave you that you've carried with you your whole life, the kind of advice that doesn't show up on a balance sheet but is worth more than gold? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. I read every single one. That spring was a tough one. The ground was cold and wet, and the window to get corn in the ground was narrow. Rich Miller was true to his word. From my back field, I could see his 8630 working on the horizon, pulling a massive 30-foot field cultivator. It crawled across the landscape relentlessly, its dual tires leaving wide, flat tracks. At night, its bank of stadium lights cut through the darkness, allowing him to work around the clock. He was a one-man army, conquering the land. Meanwhile, I was fighting it. My 1066 was a powerhouse for its day, but pulling a 15-foot chisel plow through that wet, heavy soil was all it could handle. I'd drop the plow in the ground, and the big 6-cylinder diesel would bark, black smoke puffing from the stack as the turbo spooled up. The rear tires would dig in, clawing for traction, the engine lugging down to a deep, guttural groan. It was a slow, arduous process. Every evening, I'd come in long after dark, my body aching, smelling of diesel and dirt, and I'd only have another 40 acres turned over. Rich was doing that in a single afternoon. The whispers in town grew louder. Jed Stone's falling behind. Can't keep up. That old red iron just ain't cutting it. One afternoon, the breaking point came. I was on my last pass in the North 80 when I felt a shudder run through the tractor. It wasn't the plow hitting a rock. It was a deep mechanical groan, followed by a sharp pop that I felt in the seat of my pants. The tractor lurched to a stop, the engine still running, but the wheels no longer turning. I knew instantly what it was. The bull gear in the rear end. A catastrophic failure. I sat there for a long moment, the diesel engine idling, the spring sun warming the cab. I looked out across the half-plowed field. It was a picture of my failure. Stranded. Beaten. I shut the engine off, and the silence that rushed in was deafening, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow. Getting it back to the shop was an ordeal. I had to walk the 2 miles home, get the old Farmall H, and drag the 1066 back chain by chain, a slow, humiliating retreat. The next day, I started tearing it down. Splitting a tractor of that size is no small feat. It meant disconnecting hydraulic lines, wiring, fuel lines, and unbolting the massive cast-iron bell housing. I used floor jacks and blocks of wood to support the two halves, slowly rolling the front end away to expose the guts of the transmission and rear differential. There it was. The main bull gear had sheared off half a dozen teeth. Metal shavings were everywhere, glittering like poison in the thick black gear oil. A new gear would cost a fortune, and it would be weeks before the dealership could even get one. I was dead in the water. Planting season was slipping away with every tick of the clock. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of black coffee, the parts catalogue open in front of me. The cost of the repairs was staggering. For the first time in my life, I considered going to the bank. I could get a loan. I could trade in the broken 1066 on something newer, something bigger. I could be like Rich. But the thought felt like acid in my stomach. It felt like betraying my father, betraying myself. There had to be another way. The next morning, I drove into town, not to the bank, but to Miller's salvage yard on the edge of the county. It was a graveyard of iron, a sprawling expanse of rusted tractors, combines, and implements, their faded colors a testament to years of hard work and eventual failure. Old Man Miller, Rich's uncle, ran the place. He was a gnarled, quiet man, the complete opposite of his nephew. I told him my problem. He chewed on an unlit cigar for a moment, then pointed with a greasy thumb toward the back of the yard. "Got a 1466 back there that rolled," he rasped. "Rear end should be the same. Might be what you need." I spent the next hour wading through weeds and scrap metal until I found it. The 1466 was a pitiful sight, its cab crushed flat, its front axle bent at a sickening angle. But as I opened the drain plug on the differential, clean oil ran out. A good sign. I spent the rest of the day in the mud and grime with a set of big wrenches and a cutting torch, wrestling the heavy gears and axle housings out of the dead machine. It was brutal, back-breaking work. As I was loading the final piece onto my truck, a brand new Lincoln Continental pulled up, kicking up a cloud of dust. Rich Miller stepped out, wearing clean slacks and a polo shirt. He looked at the greasy, mud-caked parts in the back of my Ford, then at me, covered head to toe in filth. "Picking up some spare parts for the museum piece, Jed," he sneered. "Just keeping the iron in the field, Rich," I said, my voice flat. "You know," he said, leaning against his car, "the dealer is offering 0% financing for the first year on a new 1086. You could sign the papers today and be planting tomorrow. Instead, you're wasting your time digging through this junk pile. It's just stubborn pride." I slammed the tailgate shut. "It's not pride, Rich, it's principle." He just shook his head and laughed as he got back in his luxury car and drove away. He didn't get it. He never would. For him, a tractor was a status symbol, a line of credit. For me, it was a partner, and you don't turn your back on a partner just because they're down. It took me 3 days and 2 sleepless nights, but I got the 1066 back together. I used a chain hoist hanging from the barn rafters to maneuver the heavy gears into place. I meticulously cleaned every part, replaced every seal, and filled the housing with fresh high-tran fluid. When I finally bolted the 2 halves of the tractor back together and turned the key, the engine fired to life with a reassuring roar. I put it in gear, let out the clutch, and it moved. I had done it. I had saved my season without borrowing a single penny. But I knew deep down that Rich was right about one thing. I couldn't keep up this way. The farms were getting bigger, the implements were getting wider, and the windows of opportunity from Mother Nature were getting smaller. The 1066 was a great tractor, but I was pushing it to its absolute limit. I needed more horsepower. I needed more traction. I needed a 4-wheel drive. But I was not going to become a slave to the bank to get one. The idea started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a crazy, impossible idea. It took root during those long hours I spent in Miller's salvage. I had seen the skeletons of giants back there, old articulated machines from the early days of 4-wheel drive, long since abandoned. What if, instead of buying new, I could build my own? Forge a machine from the bones of dead ones. A machine that would be mine, free and clear. It was a fool's errand, and I knew it. The whole county would laugh. But as I finished my spring planting, days behind everyone else, the idea grew from a whisper to a roar. It was a gamble, a massive undertaking that would consume my entire winter and every spare dollar I had. But it was my way, the Stone way. The boom years of the mid-1970s rolled on, and the gospel of get big or get out was preached from the steps of the courthouse to the counters of the local diner. Grain prices stayed high, fueled by massive exports to the Soviet Union. Land that had sold for $500 an acre 5 years ago was now fetching $2,000, and the bankers were happy to lend against it. It was a gold rush, and Rich Miller was leading the charge. He bought another 160 acres, then another 80. His operation swelled to over 1,000 acres. He traded in his year-old 8630 for the new, more powerful 8640. He bought a brand-new International 1460 axial flow combine, a machine so large it looked like it could swallow my whole barn. His line of equipment, all shiny and new, was the talk of the county. He was the very picture of modern agricultural success. He built a new ranch-style house for his family on a hill overlooking his land, and drove a new pickup every year. Meanwhile, I stuck to my 320 acres. I was making good money, better money than my father ever had. But instead of leveraging it, I was saving it. I paid off my operating loan at the end of each year and put the profits into certificates of deposit at the local savings and loan. I kept driving my old Ford, I kept living in the same modest farmhouse my grandfather had built. To men like Rich, I was a failure. A man paralyzed by fear, too timid to seize the opportunity that was right in front of him. I'd hear the talk when I went into town. Poor Jed Stone, sitting on his hands while the rest of the world gets rich. His father's stubbornness rubbed off on him. He'll get left in the dust. I ignored them. I was focused on my winter project. I had found my monster in the back corner of Miller's salvage yard, half swallowed by overgrown thistle and sumac. It was an early Steiger Bearcat too, one of the first ones they built up in Fargo. The story was it had been in a barn fire. The cab was a melted, blackened heap of steel and glass. The tires were burned off the rims. The wiring was a charred, brittle mess. The big Caterpillar 3208 V8 engine was seized solid from the heat and the water used to put out the fire. It was a complete wreck, a 10-ton piece of scrap iron. But as I looked closer, I saw the good bones. The frame was straight and true, massive beams of quarter-inch steel. The Clark axles and planetaries, the heart of any four-wheel drive, looked undamaged. The transmission housing wasn't cracked. I paid Old Man Miller scrap price for it. He just shook his head as I hauled it home in 2 trips with a borrowed lowboy trailer. "You're a bigger fool than I thought, Jedediah," he'd said, though there was a twinkle of respect in his eye. That winter, my barn became my sanctuary and my crucible. While Rich was in his heated shop polishing the paint on his new Deere, I was in my drafty, unheated barn, warmed only by a kerosene torpedo heater and the fire of my own determination. The first step was a full teardown, every nut, every bolt. I used the Farmall H with a loader to pull the seized cat engine. It fought me every step of the way. I broke 3 wrenches and busted my knuckles more times than I could count. Once the engine was out, I started on the rest, labeling every part, every hose, every bracket. By Christmas, the Steiger was nothing but a bare frame sitting on blocks. I spent a week with a wire wheel on a grinder, taking it down to bare metal, erasing the scars of the fire and years of neglect. Then came the primer, 2 coats of rust-inhibiting red oxide, applied with a brush in the freezing cold. The engine was the biggest challenge. The 3208 was a good motor, but this one was junk. I found a replacement at a truck salvage yard 2 counties over. It was out of a wrecked Ford Louisville grain truck and had low miles. Getting that 1,500-pound block of iron mounted in the frame was a week-long battle of chain hoists, pry bars, and pure cussing. I rebuilt the axles myself, replacing every seal and bearing. I rewired the entire machine from scratch using a thick, tattered service manual I'd bought through the mail. I built a new cab out of sheet steel and plexiglass. It was ugly, functional, and had no air conditioning or radio, but it would keep the winter wind off my face. I gave it a new coat of paint, not Steiger green, but international red, to match the rest of my fleet. I christened it the Grizzly. By the time the first hints of spring arrived in 1976, it was done. It was a patchwork beast, a testament to junkyard ingenuity and stubborn resolve. It wasn't pretty. The welds were mine, strong but not neat. The paint was already chipped in places, but when I climbed into the homemade cab, turned the key, and that big Caterpillar V8 diesel roared to life, shaking the very foundations of the barn, I felt a pride I had never known. I had built my own battleship, and it didn't owe a single dollar to any bank. The first time I drove it out of the yard, the whole town seemed to notice. People slowed their cars down to stare. Rich Miller drove by in his new Lincoln, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He saw a pile of junk. I saw my freedom. That spring, the Grizzly proved its worth. I hooked it to a 24-foot chisel plow, an implement my 1066 could never have dreamed of pulling. The Cat V8 didn't even grunt. I dropped the plow into the soil, and the tractor just walked away with it. The 4 massive tires digging in and pulling with unrelenting force. I did all my primary tillage in 4 days. It took me nearly 3 weeks with the 1066. The good times kept rolling for farmers like Rich. The price of corn and soybeans stayed high, but a few whispers of trouble were starting to snake through the optimism. The Federal Reserve was talking about raising interest rates to fight inflation. The news on the radio was full of talk about the oil embargo and rising fuel costs. I was at the bank one afternoon, moving some money from my checking account into another CD, when I saw Rich meeting with the bank president, Mr. Abernathy. They were laughing, signing a thick stack of papers. As Rich left, Abernathy saw me and waved me over. "Jedediah," he said, his voice a little too cheerful, "you ought to let me put some of that money to work for you. The Carlson place next to yours is coming up for sale. With your savings as a down payment, we could finance the rest. Land values are only going one way, my boy. Up." "I'm happy with what I've got, Mr. Abernathy," I said. "I sleep better at night knowing the deed in my safe deposit box is the only one with my name on it." He sighed, polishing his glasses. "You're a good farmer, Jed, but you're thinking like it's 1950. This is a new era. You have to use debt to your advantage." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, the rates on these operating loans are starting to climb. Variable rates. If the prime rate goes up, so do the payments. A man with too much debt could find himself in a tight spot if things turn south." He was giving me a warning. I looked out the window at Rich climbing into his expensive car. He was leveraged to the breaking point, and he was betting the farm, his and the bank's, that the good times would last forever. As I walked out of the bank, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The sun was shining, the fields were green, and the money was flowing. But high above, in the clear blue sky, I could almost see the storm clouds gathering. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the rain was coming. The year 1979 was the peak. The fever pitch. Corn hit $3.50 a bushel, and you couldn't find a farmer who wasn't smiling. Rich Miller was more than smiling, he was incandescent. He'd traded up again to a John Deere 8640, the new king of the field, its engine humming with 300 horsepower. He'd bought another 200 acres, this time on contract, with a balloon payment due in 5 years. At the co-op, he talked less about farming and more about hedging the market and depreciation schedules. He was playing a different game now, one with numbers on paper, far removed from the feeling of soil in your hands. I kept my head down. The Grizzly, my homemade Steiger, had proven itself a reliable beast. It was ugly and loud, but its simple mechanical soul was easy to understand and even easier to fix. I spent a weekend that summer replacing the center pivot bearings, a heavy, greasy job that cost me $200 in parts and a few layers of skin on my knuckles. A month later, I saw the John Deere service truck at Rich's place for 3 days straight. The talk in town was that the quad-range transmission had gone out on his 8640. A $10,000 repair, all dealer labor and parts. Rich just laughed it off. "It's a write-off," he'd said, "the cost of doing business at this scale." The turn came not with a bang, but with a voice on the radio. It was January of 1980. I was in the shop, grinding a new edge on a set of chisel plow points, when the news came on. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was embargoing all grain sales to the USSR. I put the grinder down, the high-pitched whine dying slowly, and listened. The announcer's voice was grave, but I don't think anyone understood what it truly meant. The next day at the elevator, we found out. The price board, which had been a source of joy for half a decade, was a bloodbath. Corn had dropped 50 cents overnight, soybeans even more. The line of trucks was gone, the mood inside was funereal. Men stood in small, quiet groups, staring at the numbers as if they were the names of the dead on a war memorial. That was the first crack in the dam. The second came at the gas pump. The crisis in Iran sent fuel prices soaring. The diesel I'd paid 60 cents a gallon for last spring was now $1.10 and climbing. For my little 1066 and the relatively efficient Cat engine in the Grizzly, it was painful. For Rich's fleet of huge, thirsty new machines, it was a hemorrhage. His cost per acre to put a crop in the ground doubled almost overnight. The first time I saw the pressure getting to him was that spring. I was welding a cracked brace on my disc when he pulled into the yard, his new Lincoln kicking up gravel. He didn't get out, just rolled down the power window. His face was pale, and the easy grin was gone, replaced by a tight, strained line. "Jed," he said, his voice clipped, "I need to run my planter through your north field to get to my new piece. The culvert on the county road is too narrow for my 40-foot planter." "Go ahead, Rich," I said, lifting my welding mask. "The ground is dry enough." "Thanks," he muttered. But he didn't leave. He just sat there, staring at the Grizzly, which was parked by the barn. That thing still run. Like a clock, I said, fired right up this morning. He shook his head, a strange look on his face. It wasn't derision this time. It was something else. My 8640 won't start. Some damn sensor in the fuel system. Dealer can't get a man out here until tomorrow afternoon. Every hour I'm not planting right now is costing me thousands. He gunned the engine of his Lincoln, the sound angry and frustrated. Everything is so damn complicated now. He drove off without another word. It was the first time I had ever heard a note of doubt in his voice. The battleship was taking on water. The final blow came from a man in a suit in Washington, D.C. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, declared war on inflation. To do it, he cranked interest rates up to levels nobody had ever seen. The prime rate, the number that controlled everything, started climbing. 12%, 15%, 18%. I ran into Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, at the post office. He looked 10 years older than he had the last time I saw him. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with worry. "Jedediah," he said, his voice low and tired, "I hope you've still got some of that money socked away." "I do," I said. "Good," he nodded, looking around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Keep it there. We're seeing variable rate operating loans, farm loans, resetting at 21%. 21%, he repeated, the words tasting like poison. "A man can't make money farming against that. It's impossible. We're going to see a lot of trouble, son. A whole lot of trouble." I went home and pulled out my old loan papers from years ago, the ones my father had co-signed. The interest rate was 6%, fixed. I looked out the window at my fields, at the barn, at the simple paid-for house. The storm Mr. Abernathy had warned me about wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. And men like Rich Miller were standing in the open field, holding a lightning rod. By 1982, the heartland was bleeding. The golden era was a distant, painful memory. The local paper was filled with auction notices, thin columns of type that read like obituaries for family farms. The Production Credit Association, once the herald of prosperity, was now the undertaker. You'd see their men, always in pairs, driving slowly down gravel roads in clean sedans, their faces grim. They never stopped to wave. The price of corn hovered around $2 a bushel, while the cost of everything from seed to fuel remained sky-high. It was a simple, brutal equation. You were losing money on every acre you farmed. For me, it was a slow bleed. I wasn't making a profit, but my savings and the interest they were earning in those high-rate CDs were enough to cover my property taxes and living expenses. I cut back everywhere I could. I ate out of my own garden, patched my own clothes, and did maintenance I might have hired out before. My world got smaller, but it was still mine. For Rich Miller, it was a tidal wave. His massive operation, once a symbol of success, was now an anchor dragging him to the bottom. His variable rate loans had reset at the peak. His monthly interest payments alone were more than my entire farm's gross income in a good year. He was farming over 1,000 acres, and every single one was a losing proposition. The scale that had been his greatest asset had become his mortal enemy. He sold off the new Lincoln first, then the pleasure boat he kept at the lake. He let his hired man go. His wife started working as a clerk at the grocery store. The changes were stark and public, and the whispers in town turned from envy to a kind of morbid pity. The breaking point came in the fall of '83. Rich had managed to get his crop in, but he couldn't afford the fuel to harvest it all. He had combines sitting in the shed while his corn stood dying in the field. The bank finally called his note. It was over. The auction was held on a cold, grey Saturday in November. The wind had a bitter edge to it, whipping across the harvested fields, carrying the scent of decay. Nearly the whole county was there, not to celebrate a man's downfall, but to bear witness to it, to see their own fears given form. They stood in clusters, hands in their pockets, their faces hard and unreadable. I stood at the back of the crowd, near an old fence line. I wasn't there to bid. I was just there because I felt I had to be. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, started with the small items from the shop. Wrenches sold for dimes, toolboxes for dollars. Then came the equipment. The massive planters and cultivators, implements that had cost tens of thousands of dollars new, sold for scrap prices. A hush fell over the crowd when they brought up the 8640. It was caked in mud, a tire going soft on one side. It looked tired and broken. It sold for less than what Rich had paid for the sales tax on it. I watched Rich and his family standing on the porch of their beautiful ranch house, the one on the hill. His wife was holding their two young children, her face buried in her son's shoulder. Rich stood ramrod straight, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, as if by not looking he could make it not real. He had lost everything: the land, the equipment, the house. All of it. The auctioneer moved on to the land itself, selling it off parcel by parcel. The out-of-state insurance companies and big-money investors bought most of it, faceless voices calling out bids over the phone to their agents in the crowd. When they got to the original Miller Home 80, the parcel with the old farmhouse and barns where Rich had grown up, a place his grandfather had homesteaded, the bidding stalled. Mr. Abernathy from the bank stood next to the auctioneer, his face ashen. This was the piece the bank was going to take the biggest loss on. A thought, unbidden, came to me. It wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about the look on Rich's face, the quiet dignity of a man watching his entire world burn down. It was about his grandfather's barns, his father's fields. Before I even knew what I was doing, I raised my hand. "I have a bid from Jedediah Stone," the auctioneer barked, his voice laced with surprise. Abernathy's head snapped in my direction. The crowd murmured, turning to look at me. I kept my hand up. I bid what the bank needed to cover their note. No one bid against me. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "To Jedediah Stone." I didn't look at Rich. I just walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling unsteady. I wrote a check, drawing on the savings I had so carefully, so stubbornly, put away for all those years. It nearly wiped me out. But as I signed my name, I didn't feel poorer. I felt right. I had survived. My father's stubborn ways, my refusal to bow to the new religion of debt, had brought me through the storm. My ugly homemade tractor sat in its shed, paid for. The land under my feet was my own. But standing there, in the wreckage of another man's dream, it felt like a hollow victory. A week later, I drove over to the Miller place. Not the new ranch house, which now had a for sale sign from the bank pounded into its manicured lawn, but the old farmstead. Rich was there, loading the last of his family's personal belongings into a rusted U-Haul trailer hitched to a beat-up station wagon. He looked thin, worn out. The swagger was gone, replaced by the slow, shuffling gait of a defeated man. He saw my truck pull in and stiffened. He walked over slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Come to look over your new property, Jed?" he asked, his voice rough. There was no anger in it, just a deep, resonant weariness. "No," I said, getting out of the truck. "I came to talk to you." We stood there for a moment in the cold, the silence stretching between us, filled only by the rustle of dry corn leaves in the ditch. "I never came over to thank you," he said finally, his eyes on the ground, "for what you did at the auction. You kept the insurance company from getting this place. My dad, he would have appreciated that. It's a good piece of ground, Rich. It should be farmed by someone who cares about it." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Well, that ain't me anymore. We're heading to the city. My wife's sister has a place we can stay. I hear they're hiring at the tire factory." His voice cracked on the last words. The thought of Rich Miller, the man who had commanded an empire of steel and soil, working on an assembly line under fluorescent lights, was a tragedy too deep for words. "That's what I came to talk to you about," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I need a hired man." He looked up at me, his eyes narrowed in confusion. "What?" "I own this place now," I said, gesturing to the old farmstead, "and my own. It's too much for one man to handle properly. I need help, someone who knows this land better than anyone, someone I can trust." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was searching for the trick, the angle, the punchline to the cruel joke. He found none. "And the house," I continued, nodding toward the old two-story farmhouse. "It's empty. You and your family can live here, rent-free for the first year, until you get back on your feet. After that, we can work something out. Call it part of your salary." He was speechless. He just stood there, his face a mixture of shock, shame, and a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years. Hope. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Why, Jed?" he finally whispered. "After everything, all the things I said. Why would you do this?" I thought for a long moment, looking past him at the old barn, its paint peeling, but its frame still strong and true. I thought of my father and his lessons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. "Because this isn't about being right, Rich," I said. "It's about doing right. And a good farmer should never be separated from his home ground if it can be helped. Besides," I added, a small smile touching my lips, "I figure you know how to work on a John Deere, and Lord knows I don't." Tears welled in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. He just nodded, unable to speak. He reached out and shook my hand. His grip was firm, the calluses still there. In that handshake, a decade of rivalry and bitterness washed away, leaving behind the common ground of two men who loved the soil. The years that followed were healing years. The farm economy slowly recovered, but it was a different world now, chastened and cautious. The wild optimism of the 70s was gone for good. Rich and I worked side by side. He was a changed man, quiet and humble, but he was also the best farmer I'd ever known. He knew the nuance of every swell and dip in the land he'd grown up on. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, as if he were atoning for past sins. I never treated him like a hired man. He was my partner. We made decisions together, and slowly he rebuilt his life. After a few years, he insisted on paying rent for the house. A few years after that, he came to me with a proposal to buy the home 80 back on contract, making payments to me instead of a bank. I agreed without hesitation. The talk in town had shifted long ago. I was no longer stubborn Jed. I was steady Jed, the man who had weathered the storm. Younger farmers, the ones who had survived, would sometimes stop by the shop, asking for advice. They'd look at the Grizzly, now faded and scarred from years of hard work, with a kind of reverence. It had become a local legend, the tractor built from junk that had outlasted the shiny new fleet. One crisp fall afternoon, years later, my son David, who was then 16, was helping me in the shop. We were working on the Grizzly, replacing a hydraulic hose that had finally given up after nearly 2 decades of service. David was a good kid, quiet like I was, with a natural feel for mechanics. "Dad," he said as he tightened a fitting, "why do we still use this old thing? Uncle Rich says we could afford a new 4-wheel drive now, one with air conditioning." I stopped and wiped the grease from my hands with a red rag. I looked at the boy, who was fast becoming a man, and then at the old red tractor that had become an extension of my own will. "We could," I said. "But this tractor teaches us a lesson, David. Your grandfather taught it to me. It's not about what you can afford to borrow. It's about what you can afford to own." I pointed to the frame. "Every piece of this machine we can fix right here, with our own 2 hands. It doesn't own us. We own it. When times get tough, and they always get tough sooner or later, the bank can't drive down our lane and take this tractor away. It's ours. That's a different kind of wealth. It's freedom." I told him the whole story then. About the boom years, about Rich's rise and fall, about the auction, and about the long road back. He listened intently, his eyes wide, understanding for the first time the history that was soaked into the very soil he walked on. Later that evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the corn stubble, I stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands. I watched the lights of 2 tractors working in the distance. One was mine, driven by my son, David, pulling the big disc with the Grizzly, its steady diesel roar a familiar comfort. The other was on the next farm over, the Miller place. It was Rich, working his own ground, in his own tractor. A modest, well-maintained John Deere he'd bought for cash 2 years ago. The air was cool and clean. The harvest was in, the bins were full, and the land was paid for. My father was long gone, but his wisdom felt as real and solid as the ground beneath my feet. I hadn't built an empire. I hadn't gotten rich. But I had held on. I had built a life, not of debt and depreciation, but of resilience and integrity. I had saved a farm, and in doing so, I had helped save a neighbor. As the last light faded from the sky, I knew I had honored my father's legacy. and I knew with a quiet, unshakable certainty that I was the richest man in the county.